The terrorist operations has engaged in insurgent terrorism or insurrection, which includes the function of protecting KKK functions for arbitrary violations of constitutional law, which is protected by the double agents such as in the judiciary, who, being disloyal to the United States, are engaged in insurrection, which disqualifies them from office according to the 14th Amendment, I believe, which states that they engaging in insurrection are disqualified from the right to hold office, which, by virtue of their confession of protecting the insurrectionist terrorism for its arbitrary damages against law abiding civilians, properties, and contracts, and other, is a military campaign against the lawful authority of the United States, which is the Republic, which is formed by the civilians. And the terrorisms and social engineering and political violence and other hate crimes of these agreements substantially changes the forming of the Republic, nullifying the existence of the Republic into the wizard courts formed government, and the wizard courts administrative government, having replaced the republic, is insurrection and a new government, and its policies, not having the authority of law, do not have the service of law and maintain contempt for law, and the agencies and government functions such as the judicial courts, which they maintain contempt for, as well as the contempt for Congress and the other forms of American effects, which is the purpose of the sedition in attacking David, who they believe would have maintained law enforcement at the federal level for the military branch, which is specifically aligned with the legislature and the judiciary, etc., which, having specialized in the guarantee of the enforcement of the superiority of the republic, blocks against the breakdown of the government structure, and having been targeted to stop that function, has actively maintained the ability of the Confederates to have progressed in power, such as William Barr's arbitrary loyalties to Confederacy through unitary executive theory, which is the statement that the legislature and judiciary have no authority over executive action specifically stated in law, such as it in the Constitution, and it being holistically ignored in favor of the anti-American government, is systematically purging all patriots from the structure. The truth probably aligns something along the lines of them converting base churches such as the Mormons in order to get loyalty to the government, quote unquote, which is the functional statement that the government, under the Confederate policies of the KKK, would be allowed to do anything as the function of insurrection, at which point their protection for of the Confederate terrorism in favor of it against the American system means their loyalty to the government is contempt for the legal processes, such as the contempt for court, which has actively denied the submission of the information to the general record to prevent the process of the government from happening, and thus their spell, loyal to the KKK wizard clan, generates the contradiction, and that contradiction is actively enforced as it is spread and exponentially expanded through the function of these frauds, which by definition has an occultist system by in which the general public at whole probably only approves of it around 5%, and as a super minority would not be able to win any actual vote, which by definition is the primary strategy, as they have already almost been eradicated, have engaged in the system of retaliation, as the parasite is freezing the immune system of the United States from being able to retaliate against the infection, at which point it requiring the existence of David's office is understood as a fundamental aspect of the strategy, as he is not affected by their disease and their parasite infection, which generates the autoimmune system uh, into its defect in order to protect the parasite instead of destroying the alien substance. David would have not, as a collective system in the military function, in the general government functions, and the others, was presumed to not be affected by that parasite, as he is superior to them under those crucial functions, at which point not being compromised to them would not defect and would then conduct the necessary actions in order to conduct the surgical removal of the insurrectionist Confederates, protected by Lindsey Graham under his policy that the Confederacy is allowed to engage in all kinds of crimes against the United States without retaliation, which is insurrection. And the contempt for the legislator and the contempt for the judiciary to have blocked those informations is the act of sedition, the function of blocking the government from conducting its legal function may not be tolerated under any argument, which is fundamentally their primary strategy of war against these United States, which includes the function of the various abuses against the general public protected by the Confederate double agents under this system, such as the Maui Fire started by the laser. There have been pictures of people who have found uh, effects of lasers shot by the Confederates or those connected under the orders to the Confederates who have hyper accelerated the investment into the strategies and technologies fundamentally necessary, at which point their engagement of doing this, having conducted the damages, can be arbitrary and then not cleaned up, such as, but is not limited to, the crimes committed against the general public of polluting with nuclear waste, such as quoted by Josh Hawley, of unmaintained systems that needed to be cleaned and were systematically ignored in favor of the injury as a fake experiment which generates the general injury as an extortion against the general public in retaliation for not being Confederate loyalists. And these fake experiments, quote unquote, which generates um, the war damages are systematic war crimes by terrorist insurgents for insurrection, and the systematic collapses of the system by these non retaliated against crimes is fundamentally how they're levying the majority of their conflicts, such as the COINTELPRO and MK Ultra functions, which being an extension of the FBI's Nazi coup, which had it been attempted, um, has actively sought the infection of the military to gain converts into the white supremacists in the military for the coup in the 80s and others as they systematically engage in these mindless insurrections. William Barr specifically quoted the fact that the legislator had, um, in times past, systematically restrained and almost put them to a complete stop until he got momentum on his work, which has systematically returned the majority of the double agents and the executives' abuses against the civilian population, which he was overwhelmingly proud of, as the maintenance of the conspiracy against rights as a fundamental aspect of their nature. They have re-engaged in the function of the KKK, which, having infiltrated into the government unnoticed, have created its own denomination into the faculties, at which point the denomination of the KKK or Confederate militia, having infiltrated those various positions, were able to conduct these damages, such as the creation of the Nazis by the FBI and the attempted Nazi coup during World War II or around World War II, whenever they specifically were arranged in order to engage in this under the unitary executive theory, which gives credence to the theory that they created the Second World War from scratch, including the function of creating some kind of roundup in order to create the Dust Bowl, at which point their poisoning of the general food in the United States would have been conducted for the extortion against the isolationist Americans in order to force them into the conflict which they created, which generates this system of monopolies, such as the creation and maintenance of the military industrial educational complex, which is functionally a letterhead cover for Confederacy. And while there are many Americans in that complex, the purpose of the structure under Fres, Ul, Bool type strategies and mechanisms from D&D generates the competent arrangements of the terrorisms against the United States in insurrection, at which point the use of the American government working correctly, such as the use of David's department, which they estimated would have existed from the foundation of the United States, would have stopped this and thus required them to remove it in order to engage in these arrangements. And under the original coup in the 80s, the Confederates, alt-right terrorists, threatened the Democrats when overthrowing California to support them in their war on David or David's party, at which points the function of removing the party by voter fraud was the extortion against the Democrats, and the Democrats would not be allowed to have a political party if they did not assist that, making an extortion, and thus the false assumption of bipartisanship while the extortion is actively engaged, at which point the gun to their head they would comply, at which point there is no majority, there is just an insurrection by a super minority of super predators. These super predators, believing that David's involvement in the general community and in the economy would have generated an insurance market primarily founded on the zombie apocalypse or other apocalypse or mass emergencies, which exponentially expanding from his overwhelmingly competent functions in the general community can be spread out into the insurance, which fundamentally makes the jurisdictions where his economy would exist too strong to be overwhelmed by their indirect conflicts, generating the compulsion to a hot war against the civilian population, which they are happy to comply with. But they blamed David for their initiation of the hot war because they're psychopaths engaged in the Hegelian dialectic, and as KKK, they are functional wizards, which is the function of using spells, which is the function of misdefining each of the words as they engage in their insurrection, as the general public believes the word means something than was intended by the wizard casting the deceit. And the expansion of this function includes the function of buying low and selling high, and thus the traumatized communities, such as the actively targeted ones by the white supremacists, would have been more desirable investments for this insurance structure, which already being competently in place, would have been able to have survived the zombie apocalypse from scratch, at which point the initial assumption is that whatever dangers they would have automated would have been inadequate for this, at which point the creation of the order would have succeeded, reclaiming the people and saving them from their enemies, at which point this would have expanded into the Hawaiians, who would have been protected by David's systems, which includes the fire insurance, uh, and the rest of the recovery systems by his aid and comfort to the law-abiding civilians. And so when they conduct their laser attacks in combination from the various phantom cells, such as their double agents and the police who told the escaping civilians to go back into the fire location so that they can be burned alive, by whatever con they said in order to get them to comply, would have been protected from this, as David's security would have bypassed all of these insurrection strategies, saving lives and property and restoring them into the preferred position. As the function of their slow growth into the sustainable positions of whatever emergencies would have been conducted into the architecture would have been hyper accelerated by the bonds, which, if the damages would have succeeded, would be triggered, which would exponentially expand into the new construction, which would have the superior security of the zombie insurance, despite each step not being taken slowly. The hyperacceleration is derived by the bond paying for the new buildings, which being built fundamentally immediately under a high grade faculty from factories specifically designing these systems, would have allowed for fast, immediate construction of those properties funded by the bonds, at which point the re-engagement of those buildings means that they would have been repaired immediately, and thus their lives would have been sustained. And the understanding that that is fundamentally true, as those loyal to the phantom cells to have abused and censored David with the coercion against the general public having been informed competently and having confidence in the thing that the terrorists think that they're stopping. At which point they, not being told the correct answer correctly, would have been misdirected into the position in order to stabilize their confidence away from investing into their legal original choice according to the warrants of the Confederates against the Americans in their insurrection. And this systematic position means, by definition, everyone who supports J. Sekulow's war, which creates letterhead covers for the terrorist insurrection, would by definition be covering for the censorship and abuses, which removes the insurance and other protections, which is responsible for the fires. So by definition, they are all murder hobo creeps engaged in insurrection. Because of their arbitrary hatreds and normal compliance of people who would join a hate group, as well as the hyperacceleration of their personal wealth and the permanent wealth of their posterity, by the Nazi strategy of destroying large parts of their population in order to accumulate more resources for themselves and for their posterity, at which point these arrangements, specifically being a financial arrangement, is in the engagement of war by an unprofessional militia in order to engage in terrorism for spoils of war against law-abiding civilians who were owed protections of the government, which were renounced by the double agents who hated them.